Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our KuppingerCole webinar, All the Roads Lead to the Sea, Paved with B2B. This webinar is supported by iWelcome. The speakers today are Marco Venuti, who is Vice President, Product Management at iWelcome, and me, Martin Kuppinger. I'm co-founder and principal analyst at KuppingerCole. Before we start, some quick information about KuppingerCole and some housekeeping information for the webinar, and then we'll directly jump into the topic of today's webinar. KuppingerCole is a global analyst company. We deliver content and services around identity and access, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence and adjacent areas through our reports, such as executive views, leadership compass documents, through analyst inquiries, webinars, advisory projects, conferences, e-learning, and other types of services. In our research, we deliver a variety of formats. Some of these are, for instance, our leadership compass, where we compare vendors in certain well-defined market segments, our executive view reports, which look at specific vendors, the advisory notes with backgrounds around trends and other topics, and our very short leadership briefs with very condensed information about certain topics. We also do advisory. We are strictly vendor neutral, but support our customers in strategy definition, in portfolio management, in technology selection, and in project guidance with our strategy compass, portfolio compass, technology compass, and project compass. And as you probably know, aside of our webinars, we have a number of other events, which include, for instance, Digital Finance World, the Blockchain Enterprise Days, our consumer identity events, and our cybersecurity related events. So look at these events in the autumn of 2019. There will be many, many interesting new events. Regarding the webinar, a little bit of housekeeping to do here. So one thing is audio control. You are muted centrally, so we are controlling these features, and you don't need to mute or unmute yourself. We are recording the webinar, and we will provide the slides for download. And there will be a Q&A session by the end of the webinar. However, you can enter questions at any time using the GoToWebinar control panel. Let's have a look at the agenda. The agenda for today is split into three parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the changing focus of identity and access management across businesses, moving more from a traditional on-premise employee perspective towards a access-focused consumer and other types of users, partner-centric perspective in the context of the digital transformation. So why is this changing, and why do you need to rethink and align your various initiatives around traditional enterprise or employee identity management, consumer and business partner identity management, or B2B identity management? In the second part, then Marco Venuti, who is the Vice President Product Management at iWelcome, will talk about how iWelcome supports these use cases which bring together B2B and consumer identity, so that you also can manage intermediaries such as agents, dealers, after-sales support, and moving forward in that space. The third area then will be the Q&A session, where we will try to provide answers to the questions you have. And as I've said, the more questions we have, the more lively and interesting the discussion will be. So let's start with a very simple perspective. Let's look at the digital transformation. It's a not really new term. And I bring up something I created a while ago, which is around how this evolves what we are doing. And a lot of these things are related to today's webinar business. So this digital transformation has a lot of external drivers, and some of these drivers include things like the dynamic partnerships. So our business models and the business partnerships are changing. So to serve our customers, we need to support these ever-changing partnerships, also the changing competitive landscape. Some might be competitors today and your partners tomorrow, or being both in some way. We have other things like innovation, the shift from product to service, etc. But alone these two things, partnerships and landscape, show that it's essential to support both the consumer and also the partners behind, the business model behind. So from an organizational key capability perspective, to succeed in this transformation, it's about innovativeness. So really deliver the new services the right way. It's about agility. So all this is far quicker, far faster than it ever has been. So it's not about taking years to construct a new product. It's about an agile evolution within these products and services you deliver to the market. And it's about the organizational flexibility. When you're agile, your organization also must be agile. We have this area of the business transformations as the next element. These business transformations are the things which then are sort of the big changes in the way we do business. And when we look at these big changes, then I collected three. One is the Internet of Things, so everything becomes connected. We have the smart manufacturing, so really for the full integration of our supply chain. And we have this notion of know your customer in a very broad sense, well beyond the regulatory aspect of know your customer, towards really knowing your customer, understanding your customer, serving your customer in perfect way. And this is also where the customer comes in. So it's the partners, it's the customers. We need to work differently. When we look at Internet of Things, it's all about also working with partners. It's not only you who build that Internet of Things. Your things connect with other services, with other apps, etc. And that is what you need to support in the things you do. And amongst these things, which are sensors and blockchain and cognitive AI, there's identity and there's security and privacy. And identity and security and privacy are essential to make your business succeed in this transformation. And today we have a webinar around identity and why it's important to work with consumers, customers, partners. And I'd like to start with a perspective that I take from the identity in the mind of the consumer. So what a consumer and customer? So the consumer hopefully becomes the customer served by you and your partners. What does he really expect? And there are a couple of things he expects. So in the mind of the customer or the consumer, he wants to use few identities. He wants to decide on which identities to use when. He wants to work everything from every device. And when he switches his device, his digital life should continue seamlessly. Privacy and security, all easy and simple. So it must be secure. So if it doesn't work as secure as it is expected, you're guilty. On the other hand, it should be super simple. It's a little bit difficult, that area, but at the end, you need to support for that, because sometimes that's the expectation. Oh yes, there are payment and commerce aspects, seamless access. So get rid of KYC processes, cumbersome registration, and allow people to work in their connected way. So it's not that there's specifically from device perspective, there's not that much the divergence between work and life anymore. So it is converging. It's not always easy to do, specifically with regulations and security in mind, but from an expectation of the consumer, it is an element he tendency has. The other aspect to look at in this context is how do we deal with our partners in business? And this, I think, is one of the areas where it's important to really sort of pave the road to your consumer with support for your partners. It's not about locked data anymore. So also the data you have from your services is not locked. You will work with the data, also with partners, with your customers, with everyone. So it's about on one hand, look at what your users want. Not every user is the same. So there are some who look very much at privacy, others don't. Ensure that you can serve that. Ensure that you comply with regulations when you deal with the data, but also be able to work with the data in a well thought out manner. A very important thing is that lock-in is not relevant and not of interest to your business partners, because if you or someone else owns too much of the data with a tendency to becoming a monopoly, then he's a risk for all the other businesses. It's a matter of balance of power, and we need to work with partners. We need to support the partners, exchange the partners, and we also will have things where data becomes more autonomous, which means we need to be able to deal with the data in a way where we are not even in a user A is connecting, user B is connecting style, but where it's even more complex. And so we need to manage all these entities in this, which are part of this digital transformation of this connected universe, in a way which goes beyond just saying, okay, I have a customer login. It's more, it's significantly more. There's a lot of change. Some of these aspects go beyond the identity piece. Some of them are a bigger story, but it is what is happening. And so when we look at how identity is evolving, so many years ago, we had this per system user management. We then introduced the first identity management, very technical, very administrator driven, synchronized accounts between various systems, etc. We had already 15 years or so, or even a little more ago, the first federation standards appearing. So how can you federate with your business partners? That was sort of the first time really going broadly beyond the internal use cases. We had a consumer identity management, and right now it's even more shared. It's really thinking into share thing. That means bring together these things, bring together all these types of identities, work with different identity providers, but also allow all of these identities in your context to be well managed. This sort of evolution is going forward, and we need to get better on that. Getting a little more technical, so to speak, so going back a little, we end up with a perspective which is more around what does it mean for standard identity and access management? It means we are going beyond IGA. So for whatever reason, PowerPoint displayed 2 arrows at the beginning, but traditionally we had a very strong perspective on this, what I tend to call deploy time identity management. So we create an account, we give him entitlements, grant him entitlements, we approve the entitlements, we have governance on these entitlements. So that is the one thing. It's really the IGA part. But we are increasingly focusing on, that's what we see amongst our advisory customers, increasingly focusing on runtime identity management. So the authentication piece in the context of the user, should it happen, or shouldn't it happen? How strong does the authentication need to be? So an adaptive authentication, authorization, and what happens in the context? What does the user really do? So user behavior, monitoring and analytics, is there something going wrong? So the context is shifting, and it's interesting. The more we move from employees, where it's about complex entitlements and still a strong focus on the deploy time thing, the more we move towards the consumers and others, the more we shift from a deploy time emphasis to a runtime emphasis. And we need to get better on that. Our identity management is changing. And that is, I think, where the bigger evolution is. How can we enable that all these various parties, all these various entities can access the data they need? And if you want to build consumer-centric solutions, it's not only about the consumer, it's about more than the consumer. There's the thing on the one end, or the device of the consumer he's using. There's the partner who supports the consumer. There are, to some extent, even your employees. So from a strategic perspective, and that is not that is a single tool. It is about a concept where you say, how can you really serve that? From an IT perspective, it's about connecting everyone to every service. So we tend to call this an identity fabric, which is a logical concept which allows to connect everyone with all the devices and things, etc., to every service. So your consumers, your partners, your employees, which need access to a variety of services, and the partners are an important element there. They have a different role, they have different notion. You have different challenges. So the one is for consumers, bring your identity, external IDs. For the partners, it's federation. It might be also partner platforms you build specifically, or extended management platforms, directory services. And you federate out, or you use traditional technologies. It's not that everything needs to be supported from one tool, but obviously you need to deliver a platform over time which delivers the access management capabilities for your consumers, your partners, and integrates what usually is there, your employee perspective. So you need to do access management. You need to also manage the accounts, which is easier for the partners, etc. And you need to also do the consent handling, privacy, and other things for all this, which is obviously more important for consumers than for others. So it's a set of services, and you need to go beyond the enterprise identity management, and you should take a perspective which is, how can you deliver this set of services in an integrated manner, based on a set of services where consumers and partners are sort of one part of the play, while the sort of the employee and the legacy are a little bit a different part of the play. From business perspective, it's a little bit a different perspective, but again, it's about what do you need, and that is really where these things again come together. How can you efficiently and successfully deliver digital services? And that means when you want to serve your customers and your consumers, it's not only about creating one whatever portal for them. It's more. It's about integrating services that are provided by your partners, for instance. It's about orchestrating stuff, reusing identities. And again, the partner comes into play. The consumer, it's not only the consumer. And you have cloud services, you have your AI services, you have legacy stuff you need to connect to build these new services. You also provide services to your partner. They provide services to you for all the digital services you are delivering to your consumers. So consumers brings the revenue and the data, the partners, the channel, but also the additional service. He is delivering services to you. In different forms, these services come together so that you can construct your digital services, the UX and the capabilities, but specifically also the identity. So the onboarding and the access of the customer and the consumer, but also managing all the partner services in an adequate way, sharing also that, allowing access to the partner service, all the other stuff which is part of that. And then you can use and monetize these services finally. So to create digital services for a digital business, you need a strong identity backing, and this identity backing must support more than a pure consumer or partner perspective. That can be constructed, and that was the idea of this identity fabric, in a variety of different ways. So if you really think about your use cases and the capabilities and the services and the functional building blocks, be it an as a service or an on-premise solution, then these are different levels. So you can construct it in different ways, but you need to take a perspective which goes beyond the singular focus on only the employees or only the partners or only the consumers. You need to think bigger, and you will not succeed with your consumers and customers when you don't serve your partners well, because we are living in a connected world. It's all connected, and it means you are working with partners, you are sharing services, you are using shared services. And this is something you need to bring together for success in your digital business. And an essential element in that is doing the identity for consumers and partners right. With that, I hand over to Marco, who is the second speaker.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin, and thank you all for joining us today. I am Marco Venuti, and indeed I am product manager at iWelcome. Apart from having spent a few years at iWelcome already, I have a fairly long experience in the identity segment. For the last 15 years, I've been working in various product company in capacity of pre-sales all the way to product manager, but in identity management, identity governance, and now consumer identity management. But today, and the spoiler is already in the title, we're going to talk around how we do address B2B specific use cases, and specifically the three key questions that I will address over the next 20 minutes or so are, first of all, what are the core B2B needs? What is B2B defined like? What kind of capability are required to properly address those scenarios? And finally, how can we as iWelcome can help in those circumstances? So first thing first, identity is a very diverse and different thing depending on the kind of scenario we're facing. There's no such a thing as a single type of identity, but rather a multitude of them, ranging from employees, which can be already broken down in different types, but including then contractor, business partner, or broker, dealers, and finally, customer and consumer. The customer and consumer is what we call the C star. And each of these identity type involves specific processes, dedicated life cycle, and specific interaction and relationship that are required to properly serve them with the kind of digital experience that we want to deliver to them. To make things a bit coarse-grained and in a way also recapping a bit of history, everything basically started with what can be defined as workforce identity management, where the users are in the range of the thousands with very low fluctuation in terms of number, and well, simple to predict in terms of how frequently and how much they will change over time. At the opposite side of the spectrum is what we call the consumer and the customers, which can be in the range of the millions, and by definition, they have a much higher fluctuation and much harder to predict. There is an in-between, of course, which is the business partner, which is in between in many ways, in between in terms of magnitude, meaning numbers, in terms of fluctuation, and in terms of predictability. Now, when it comes to these use cases, let me just give you a couple of examples of what I mean with the in-between, picking ordinary scenario that we assisted in an industry such as, for instance, the insurance one, where you have the insurance that is of course featuring different types of customers, such as retail customer and business customer. And apart from featuring services devoted to those specific customers, there are intermediaries such as agents and brokers, where agents are just working for a single insurance company, while broker, of course, have a similar relationship with multiple insurance company at the same time. So that is already an example of an in-between type of persona that is, well, in a way is a customer to the insurance, but is a provider to the final good customers that the insurance is providing. A more layered example with a few more identity types can be pulled from the manufacturing B2B ecosystems, where the company is providing goods, again, to retail customers or business consumers, and those services and those goods are reaching those individuals through a layer of agents, which are then funneled through distributors and wholesales, and of course are involving dealers, which are the one having the final contact, and as services and goods might require, there is field services also involved. We have here already another 4 or 5 types of different types of persona, which are, again, in the middle, in the kind of digital experience that links the company to the final users of the goods and services provided. So my claim here is that basically the notion of consumer is something relative, something that flows all along the chain of different types of persona involved in those scenarios. So to make that short and sweet, basically everybody can be considered a C, meaning a customer, meaning a consumer, to somebody else upstream. Okay, and in that light, we can paint more types of scenario apart from the 2 that I just depicted, with different way to call them, right? So here, just in the I'm just trying to enumerate a few more examples. For instance, at times we see that called as B2B access, so meaning, again, basically the example I just gave, such as broker delegation, for instance, specifically in the industry, in the insurance sector, or even customer care, which is a variation which is involving business users delivering services to customers. So it's a B2C explicit use case scenario. Temporary user are another good example. And finally, again, multi-brand and shop-in-shop nesting, which is another notion of layered customers leading to a final layer of consumer. So all this kind of scenario have something in common. All those flavors of C star, again, consumer or customer, those intermediate party, are sharing some needs, some problems, right? Such as the fact that they are often offered a fragmented experience and maybe not necessarily provided with a unified way to sign in, and not managed in a consistent unified fashion. More, as they are not part of the company, they are subject to GDPR rights, right? And that is often addressed on a per application base, so in a siloed fashion with replicated control and with a lack of a centralized ledger. So all of these aspects are less than ideal and are bringing to a specific set of needs, which is a bit broader than what the workforce or the consumer identity typically require. And I will be more specific about them in a minute. Typically, needs that are a blending of what traditionally is defined identity management and access management. So B2B is very much a combination of the two, pretty much all the time. And even wording-wise, and the way it's called, we assisted to still a bit of different way to refer to that, including delegation, relationship management, B2B identity management, but not limited to them. Now, that being said, okay, what are the key needs? What are the key requirements which are meant to be addressing those needs? So, historically, we assisted before, and that's definitely also related to where we are at today, to very mature solutions to address the workforce, identity, and the consumer space. They are dedicated solutions, and they do a very nice job, a multitude of software in the cloud and on-prem to address those kind of needs. It's worth mentioning that there is no such a thing as of today as a single player, a single solution that spans thoroughly the entire spectrum of use cases and needs, ranging from those originated from the employee community all the way to the consumer. So it's very much of a segmented thing yet. While at the same time, hybrid scenario, meaning with coexistence of different types of identity, is increasingly frequent, if not the norm already. So all in all, that boils down to very frequent types of requirement, which I thought it would have been good to capture in a real life example. So what I'm giving you now is an excerpt from an RFP, of course, not the entirety of it, just a few liners, but just to get the gist of it. We assist more and more to explicit B2B scenario, right? Where the B2B is again, B2B, but also B2C at the same time. In this case, is a manufacturing company with thousands of dealers, and then a rental company also in the thousand, and a network of direct representative in selected country. And explicitly, they have two major types of relationship that they want to maintain, the B2B and the business to consumer. What is that meaning? What do they expect from an identity management solution to address those needs? There is a long list of requirements as usual, but what deserves attention for the purpose of our conversation today, if we look at, for instance, row 8 and 9, there is a notion of layering, there is a notion of hierarchy, of structure, of multiple entities that are in chain in leading the path to the final customer. That's what is here defined as multi-layered user management, or can I manage hierarchy, right? Another interesting thing that worth mentioning is related to row 10 and 11, and is about, well, those are not employees, I need to register them. How flexible is your registration process? Can I provide some sort of validation around those identities? This is very typical scenario that we assist in B2C too. Again, the reason for bringing this up is just to express clearly what I think would have been good to capture in the slide that I'm now projecting, which is in a way comparing the three major types of identity management that we currently see. So I thought about, well, what defines workforce identity management along the line of the self-service capability that need to be provided, the user manager, so the man that manages other people capability, and what kind of integration, what kind of delivery model. Well, workforce is really about access request management, access approval, integration with the HR system, of course, because it's workforce identity, and very often because of the complexity of the integration, because of the fine-grained access control that they want to have on application, is very much of an on-prem play still these days. Well, if we look at the B2B, which is, well, maybe is expected to be fairly close, well, actually is not at all. When it comes to B2B, out of the example I just delivered, it's very much of a self-registration play, thing that you don't usually have at all in workforce. It's around profile and consent preferences management. It's around managing the registration process in a flexible way and integrating possibly with CRM solution. And if we are integrating with application, as often the case is in a coarse-grained fashion, right? And to the point that frequently we assist to customer addressing B2B needs with a joint adoption of identity governance and access management, or identity governance and consumer solution. Now, if you look at what consumer is like, the proximity with the B2B space is significant. Much closer, the consumer to the B2B rather than the B2B to the workforce, which is in a way, at least was to me, counterintuitive, right? Again, this is another way to say what I started off with. A business user is nothing but a consumer to somebody else. Now, key capability, now getting to the next level, what it takes to do a good job in addressing the needs for identity management in a B2B scenario. Well, basically, the key thing is that B2B partners are company themselves, meaning they have their own employees and contractor, and they require a flexible registration process because they need to be onboarded somehow, and they're not coming from the HR system by definition. They are subject to GDPR because they are not contractually bound to our company, right? And so they need to be able to express consent on what we're doing with their personal data and to withdraw that. They need to be provided with secure access, secure authentication, not really sensing or being scared about password strength or level of security, but rather to prevent what otherwise would be a likely attitude in sharing account. And we don't want to have that for sure. Finally, sorry, not finally, but delegation is also very important. Delegation model and the way we manage the layers of delegation of who can do what on whom is extremely relevant by definition. And finally, Tero UI. There are so many different persona. In our manufacturing example before, there were 4 types already. That flexibility in what type of capability we offer to the various type of individual is extremely important. Now, how can I welcome help in these cases? Well, I welcome is a consumer identity management solution, or at least this is the main way that we are identified with, although worth mentioning that we actually do 2 things. We do consumer identity management and B2B identity management because of what I just said, because of the proximity that there are among the 2 worlds, right? And in that light, we are providing our customers with the master record for identity and consent to provide our C-star, again, consumer and customers, a secure and frictionless experience where we manage their right, their consent, and their preferences. Of course, we can integrate with the various applications, and we can relieve those applications in the back end from the otherwise required need to manage identity and consent complexity. So back to the key capabilities, the 5 key capabilities that I enumerated a couple of slides ago. Let's have a quick look at what we mean with a bit more detail with those sort of things. So one after another, the first one being the interaction flow, meaning, again, we are onboarding business users or customers. Well, that means that there's a number of possible processes that need to be followed in the way I maybe invite them, or maybe I have them self-registering or through social network, or maybe with some activation and validation processes that are involved. There is a big diversity out there. So a key capability in a B2B solution is to have flexibility in addressing those scenarios and maybe sample flow with the most common one, okay? In, again, managing that, all those possible interactions. Worth mentioning that this kind of complexity is unexisting in the workforce identity because you don't have that problem. You don't need to manage self-registration at all. Second capability, which is GDPR and consent management. Consent means that we need to capture and we need to allow and we need to empower the user to express their acceptance of terms and conditions, for instance, which is what we usually call coarse-grained consent management, meaning on a document, I consent or I'm not, I agree or I do not agree, and opposed to fine-grained consent management, which is on an individual attribute base. We manage the 2 of them, and we can have for each and every attribute a number of that we have already out-of-the-box controls to represent and manage in the UI and through API user consent, but also that can be extended should there be any need to represent other notion of preferences that are relevant for a specific customer, okay? But in general, again, consent management is now required, which is not the case, again, in the consumer, in the workforce space. Third capability, multi-factor authentication. again, as I said before, is of course intrinsically valuable per se for obvious reason, which is I believe everybody would agree about, but maybe not so intuitive is that the core reason to adopt MFA in a scenario like this one is not really to because we don't like password or because we find them not secure enough. It's not about that. It's not about security. It's about habit. It's about discipline. It's about preventing and avoiding people from sharing accounts. If I'm delegating a broker to create other people, other broker working for him, it's very likely and very convenient for him to share his account to get access to maybe the mother insurance company's system. If it wasn't, that now having a mobile phone where you need to push and swipe to log in, that can no longer be the case. So main reason is preventing shared account. Of course, in that case, we mean that we can provide a mobile app that can be rebranded to reflect the corporate image. Capability number 4, dedicated delegation model. This is maybe among the various ones that I just enumerated, the most complex one in terms of where complexity resides. Okay, again, we saw before, there are multiple layers of customers. There are multiple ways by which I could possibly group them up and offload the otherwise overwhelming overhead in managing people part of those organizations, which are again company by themselves. So I need to be able, as a master company, to empower users, which are power users, and delegate them on specific action and on specific fraction of other user population, so that they can create, possibly, and invite or register other users. They can profile them, not necessarily limited to deliver application access, can be all sort of thing, changing attribute value or triggering specific action on other platforms. So there's a big spectrum of option in what profiles means. And finally, more importantly, those power user can delegate other power user downstream. So to create this notion of multiple layers of delegation that is crucial in complex scenario. 5th capability, tailor UI. Different type of people, of course, might require different type of persona. When users are in the thousand, change management training has an impact. I don't want to spend money in training. The user interface need to be sleek and tailored to really what is really required. So power users are not that many, might be offered and usually are a richer UI with more options, but other types of user might be fairly limited, for instance, in just having a read-only access to KPIs or maybe just to change and reset password of customers, and others are maybe just limited to have a dashboard with tiles for specific application they can get access to. With that, I'm getting to the final slides of my presentation today. So again, why I welcome can help? Well, because 2 reasons. First, we provide capabilities in the consumer space, which has been extended over time to better serve the B2B needs, not incidentally, but because of the customer we had the luck to serve in terms of emerging requirement. And we have been addressing this sort of needs for quite some time now. So is something that organically emerged out of some recent experience. And in general, with the solution we provide, we are optimizing and enhancing the B2B journey to those customers whenever they have needs that are involving a combination of identity and access management requirement for users which are not coming from an HR system, but again, from other sources or maybe just registering themselves, and with extensive delegation, registration, and validation processes required. And with that, Martin, I would give it back to you and I would open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Marco, for all that information provided and the insight and your perspective on these use cases. And I think there are really many use cases, as I said, where these things overlap. So we need to think this bigger. And with that, I want to switch over to our Q&A session. We already have a couple of questions here. And maybe we go through this step by step. So Marco, the first one appears to be targeted to you, which is, do you provide application provisioning? And how do you enable access for users?
Okay, yes, good question. Absolutely, yes. We do offer application provisioning as part of the product capability. Again, we are coming from a consumer solution, right? So we do two things. We provide just-in-time provisioning, and that is, I would say, absolutely expected. And we do have standard support for SCIM to manage provisioning, and also we have a subscription API to allow third-party adapters to consume the changes that are originating in our platform. What I mean with that is that we do provide just-in-time provisioning, which is coarse-grained provisioning on target application, but we also allow third-party identity management solution or adapters that the company might already have to be reused, pulling the changes that are originated from our platform to be propagated on target application on both directions.
Okay, another question I have here is, would I welcome also support approval workflows to validate self-service access requests?
Okay, yeah, good question. Well, we do support approval flow, and we, as I think I clarified before, we have approval flow as part of the registration processes. We do have options to configure the approval flow associated to access requests, although at the moment are fairly, there are three examples of a pre-canned approval flow, but we do not allow customization of those approval flow, okay? So just to make it clear, we can have the manager approval or we can have the auto approval, but we don't yet allow, for instance, to have 3 nested level of approvals. Mm-hmm. That kind of complexity is, in our case, more belonging to the registration processes and validation.
Yeah, and frequently it's really that you say, okay, there's one person who approves. That is, I would say, correct, a very, very common scenario. So another question here, that's maybe one which is relevant to both of us, and you might start with that. That question is for customers who manage B2B relationships today in a legacy way, EA using a standard legacy provisioning approach. What is the recommended path to transition to runtime or real-time access?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Meaning that
shall I rephrase?
Would,
yes. Maybe, yeah. So it's really about, you know, currently you might just do, I have a standard provisioning workflow. I create a new right, B2B user, and that is really perspective. He has an account on that, but if you want to do it more in a or add the access perspective and do registration more flexible, more self-service style, what would be the recommended migration path, or maybe also extension path? It might be also more an extend the current scenario path for these users.
Yeah, I would probably start from access, meaning that traditionally B2B scenario I assisted before are very much addressing the identity management, the identity governance side of the use cases. Access not so much. So probably that would be the first angle I would approach it with. Maybe providing the B2B users with a unified entry point, with a launchpad for the application they can get access to, assuming that is not already there, of course, right? And that would be the first step. In an ordinary, in a traditional scenario, would assume that their onboarding process is managed in some other form, which I can only guess here very frequently out of what we assisted before, is very frequently about uploading periodically list of users or maybe pulling them from some Active Directory specific node or things like that. That would be the second part of it. Maybe I would go there in doing a different job in the way the onboarding is accomplished as a second step. That would be, again, an approach that I would recommend, but it is devil is in detail, right? It probably would be very interesting to have a conversation with whoever asked about that, yeah, to provide more recommendation, more special recommendation.
Yeah, so Marcus, thank you for that part of the answer. And I believe it is really, so my perspective would be look at really this bigger identity management piece. So when you think in this identity fabric context of really connecting everyone to everything, what do you already have? What are the things which are missing? Which are how can you sort of which capabilities are you lacking? Which further services do you need, and what can be done with your existing services? How to complement this? So really create this architectural picture. So we have more granular ones than the one I had shown. Map what you have to that on a capability or a little deeper on a technical service level. Look at the building blocks and then think about how to deal with that. So are there things you can continue to use, which you just complement with or extend with something new? Are there things you need to fundamentally replace? What is your strategy on that? So really starting with a well thought out and very structured process on creating that picture, and then adding, as Marcus said, the capabilities you need. And so that answer sort of brings me directly to another question which was directed to me, which was on my slides 13 and 14, so the ones with the identity fabric. So Martin, where do you see the role of identity hubs fitting into the connection between business partners and services? So sometimes they're identity hubs which create, for instance, connections between different B2B entities and companies or between to services. It depends a little on the notion of what is meant by an identity hub, but that could be, for instance, something, if it's more the identity provider perspective, it would be something which I would see in sort of in the next level of granularity beyond that slide I had been showing. So the next level of granularity, for instance, includes things such as a IDP in there. So the IDP is something which sits in between the various types of identities and the sort of the identity fabric supporting all of these. And so I think this is more matter of granularity within this concept. I hope that answers the question. With that, I would move to the next one, which is again one which is directed to Marco. Marco, do you see scenarios where a contract management database would be the source for identities, specifically the B2B identities? Maybe you even have already implementations of something like that.
Well, I don't have implementation specifically of contract management solution, but again, it is an example that applies in general to potential integrating with CRM solution, with contract management solution, with any sort of other solution that can be the authoritative source for identity. So specifically on contract, I don't have any specific case that I assisted before, but I have other scenario for, well, in one case was a document management system. That's the closest I can think of, where we were pulling identity information, okay, meaning authoritative source, or where it was initiating the journey of the digital identity representing a user.
Okay.
That is doable, again, in my post follow-up workflow implication for the validation, just like any other source, okay, of course.
Yeah. Marco, what do you mean with tailor the UI? Can it be rebranded or changed somehow? Can I build my own UI?
Cool. Yeah, very good information. Yeah, I could have clarified that better. Tailor UI means two things indeed. First, that can be tailored, meaning that there is a lot of configuration option to show or hide capabilities depending on the type of persona. Show or hide meaning coarse grain capability, but also, of course, which fraction of data the user can actually see in there. It can also be rebranded to reflect the corporate style. And very frequently, but that is belonging more to the consumer rather than to the B2B, we assist to customers which are just leveraging the API to build ground up their own customer experience, okay? Because again, the entire thing is also flanked by API, potentially to customize the way that the user experience is like, okay? But again, this is more really C, meaning consumer, rather than the extended notion of C, which is also customer and B2B party.
Okay, we have some more questions already. Another one is again about this integration with what you already have. So how would you integrate with an existing identity lifecycle for B2B users So sometimes there is some life cycle of that, so it's not as much self-registration, but it's someone coming in. How would you integrate with that? So not mimicking or duplicating an existing life cycle, but just integrating.
Okay, so life cycle to me means that we already, I'm assuming here, I'm just guessing, okay, that there is already in place a life cycle in terms of onboarding, provisioning, and profiling and offboarding.
Yes.
If that's the case, the missing bit might be the runtime experience in getting access to those applications, okay? So in a way, I'm going back to the similar question we got before. I would probably look at that first. I'm making a better job in the way I deliver a smoother and frictionless everyday experience. So allowing the user to have a single pane of glass for the various applications can get access to, having a 2FA access, and allowing him to request from there incremental access. That would be the first thing. But in doing that, of course, I would need to still consume existing identity for an existing repository. That would mean an integration to be achieved through the protocols and standards that I defined before, so through scheme and subscription API, to keep in sync the identity data with the existing infrastructural components.
Okay. Another question here that might be slightly out of scope, but maybe you can give some thoughts around that. So we had more to focus on B2B identities today, but on the other hand, there are devices and things as well which need to be managed, which need sort of access, self-registration, consent, etc. Are these things you're looking at? How do you address these scenarios?
I'm sorry, which scenario?
Devices and things which are connected to the users.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, it's indeed something we haven't covered today, but in a way there is also, I haven't gone that deliberately in this presentation, right? Just to look only at the carbon-based being, but even the silicon-based being have some similarities. There is indeed, and is applicable, the notion of device onboarding and device delegation, very similar to what we can do on people, of course, with limited set of action and with limited attributes that are making sense. So again, I haven't been expressing anything specifically about that during the presentation today, but we do actually have both B2B, I would say B2T, business to thing, and C2T and consumer to thing use cases that we address with our platform, where we have device onboarding, binding with people, and in the B2T case, also delegation of device control across different individuals. In many ways, there are similarities. Of course, makes no sense to talk of UI when you talk thing and just API.
Okay. I think we have room for one, maybe two more questions. And one I have here is totally different angle. Do you provide 2FA, so two-factor authentication, also with other solutions than your own? So do you integrate with 2FA
yes.
technologies?
Yeah. Again, we have a plugin approach, and so we integrate already with different providers or third-party popular, I would say, 2FA solution. The reason why we also have our own one is to provide a one-stop shop option for customers. But let me be clear, we offer 2FA for the B2B scenario. We do not offer, or usually we don't do that for consumer, for the C scenario, because in that case, probably there are solutions which are better suited than our one to address that sort of specific use cases and the need for an SDK. For B2B usage, we do have our 2FA. That being said, again, we have multiple integration with different 2FA providers.
Okay, thank you, Marco. I think we are done with all the questions. We had a huge number of questions today. Thank you very much for providing the answers. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you to all the attendees for listening to this KuppingerCole webinar. Hope to have you soon back again in one of our upcoming webinars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.